I don't think I'm betraying any secrets here when I thought Boris Johnson was the wrong person to be Prime Minister. Full stop. So I think that answer has to be seen within that context.
Did you consider yourself, against that background and your considerable ministerial experience, to be precisely the right First Minister for the job?
No, that's not how I would have thought of it at all. I was the First Minister when the pandemic struck. There's a large part of me wishes that I hadn't been, but I was, and I wanted to be the best First Minister I could be during that period. It's for others to judge the extent to which I succeeded.
Thank you. It's undeniable that you had the previous experience of the H1N1 crisis. That's simply a fact. And that you had considerable experience in dealing with health matters, in particular as you had been Cabinet Secretary for Health. I'd be interested to know, Ms Sturgeon, whether in the juxtaposition between that simple state of affairs and your opinions shared by some others of Mr Johnson, that you saw a political opportunity in the fact that you were well equipped in your mind to deal with the response and he was not?
No. The answer I gave you a moment ago about Boris Johnson, I don't remember thinking that in the moment. I've made the political comment about my views of Boris Johnson generally. In those early days of the pandemic, my view was, and my experience was, that we were all trying our best in almost impossible circumstances. To the next bit of your question, did I see an opportunity? I didn't see an opportunity of any description in COVID. I saw a threat, a risk, a catastrophe. My memories of the early part of 2020 in terms of how I was feeling and thinking and the emotions that I was experiencing was at first fear at what might be about to unfold and confront the country. At times, and I think you've seen snippets of perhaps the sort of human side of being a leader and a politician in these moments. At times in those early days, I felt overwhelmed by the scale of what we were dealing with. And perhaps more than anything, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to do the best I could. And so the idea that in those horrendous days, weeks, I was thinking of a political opportunity, I find, well, it wasn't true.
Could I ask you some questions, please, about the way in which you and others within the Scottish Government used informal methods of communication in order to discuss matters connected to the pandemic? In your statement dated the 16th of November, that's INQ 000273980, at paragraph 48, you say, "Throughout the pandemic, I sought to be open, transparent and accountable in respect of all decisions being taken. While acknowledging some of the issues presented by the sheer pace and magnitude of what we were facing in early 2020, I set out in my Module 2A statement the high degree of formality around Scottish Government decision-making. Decisions were informed, shaped and taken mainly through deep dive sessions, gold discussions and cabinet meetings. I feel that the nature of the communication that has emerged from the UK Government has created an impression that we were all communicating in such a way. That was not the case, certainly not as far as communications I was party to are concerned. The culture within the Scottish Government during the period in question was serious, formal, purposeful and collegiate. During the pandemic, I did not make extensive use of informal messaging and certainly did not use it to reach decisions. Is it still your position today that you and the Scottish Government were open, transparent and accountable in your actions, not just in your words, at all times throughout the pandemic response in Scotland?
Yes, that is still my position. Openness and transparency with the Scottish public was very important to me from the outset of the pandemic. I communicated to the public on a daily basis for a lengthy period of time. We will not have got every decision right, and we will have made misjudgments, and there will be undoubtedly instances put to me today where, on reflection, I will think that we could have been more transparent than we were. But given the nature of the emergency that we were confronted with, building a relationship of trust with the public was important. And in my view then, and in my view now, that had to be built on a spirit of openness.
It appears from that, and indeed the other messages which have now come to light, that informal messaging, in particular WhatsApp, was a frequent part of the way in which the Scottish Government conducted its business in COVID. Were you unaware of the fact that that was the case as First Minister during the course of the pandemic?
The exchanges you refer to, I would have had no knowledge of and had no sight of before seeing them in the course of this inquiry. If you're asking me, Mr Dawson, did I not know that anybody in the Scottish Government was using WhatsApp? Of course that's not the case. WhatsApp had become, in my view, probably too common a means of communication. But I think the exchanges you're talking about would, certainly from what I have seen, would not suggest that government decisions were being taken through WhatsApp. WhatsApp was a means of communication that people were using to exchange information on occasion, sometimes to share views about things, and using language or rather ways of describing things that perhaps wouldn't have been done in different forms of communication. One of the reasons, and if I thought this before COVID and this inquiry, I certainly think it even more strongly now. One of the reasons why I don't believe that WhatsApp, for example, should be used for government communication and decision making is that, you know, when I make a public statement, or when I made public statements as First Minister in this context, I would think very, very carefully about the words I use to try to minimise as far as is ever possible the scope for what I was saying to be misinterpreted. When people send messages on WhatsApp, they don't think, including me, you don't think that deeply about how you're phrasing things, and therefore messages, when they are looked back at later on, can be open to different interpretations because people haven't really thought about the words they're using or the phraseology that they're using. And I think that certainly would be true of some of the exchanges that the inquiry has been looking at.
Would you, as First Minister, not have thought it to be important that ministers and senior officials would think deeply about the conduct of government business, whether conducted through WhatsApp or otherwise?
Of course, that is the case. And in saying that, I'm not trying to suggest that people were not thinking deeply. The form of, and I think every human being probably can recognise what I'm saying, the form of communication can influence the phraseology or the way in which things are worded. And informal communication, I think, lends itself to very short, sharp exchanges that would be very different if you were making a speech or putting something in a formal paper for decision making. Can I say very clearly, when I was First Minister, I would not have expected any of my ministers or any of my officials to have been conducting substantive government discussions, and certainly not taking government decisions through WhatsApp or other informal means of messaging.
Thank you for that. On the 27th of May of 2020, as we covered with Mr Swinney yesterday, in the Scottish Parliament, in response to a question about whether you would order a public inquiry into the COVID-19 outbreak in care homes in Scotland, you replied as follows: "Of course there will be a public inquiry into this whole crisis and every aspect of this crisis, and that will undoubtedly include what happened in care homes." So at that stage, you knew that there would be a public inquiry in the future into the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic generally?
I always assumed there would be a public inquiry.
In fact, of course, as we know, you effectively had the power to order.
Indeed,
an inquiry,
and as it turned out in Scotland, we have more than one inquiry, so yes, I did.
Yes. On the 3rd of August 2021, Leslie Fraser, who I mentioned a moment ago, and another civil servant whom you'll know, Mr Kenneth Thompson, sent a do not destroy email to Scottish Government officials with the subject COVID-19 Independent Inquiry Record Retention, explaining the importance of retaining relevant material to the work of the inquiry. Do you recall receiving that email?
I do not, as far as I am aware, I did not receive that.
You recall, I would imagine in a general sense, that such a notification was sent out?
I would say that I don't think I would have required to see that to know that matters that were relevant to matters of substance, salient, relevant to the inquiry should be retained, and that I had a duty, as all ministers and officials would have had a duty, to ensure that anything that they were exchanging in informal messaging, if they were not retaining those messages in line with the policies that were in place, then there would be a clear record of anything on the Scottish Government systems. We
subsequently learned from your second statement that you had used various informal means of communication for some messaging with Mr Youssef, Ms Lloyd, Mr Swinney, Ms Freeman, Dr Calderwood, Dr Smith, Professor Leach, Ken Thompson, Leslie Evans, Professor Sridhar, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, and the former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill. Is that correct?
Yes.
You produced no messages with any of these individuals with your first statement. Is that correct?
Yes, but as I also say in the statement, those messages would have been extremely limited. If I take John Swinney, for example, it has never been our practice, not just during the pandemic, but generally to text. I don't think I've ever WhatsApped John Swinney, and certainly if I have, it would be the exception. But text messages would be very occasional, and the nature of the text messages that I would have with John Swinney would be, are you free to speak? Or can I pop in to see you? It's just never been in the nature of it. With some of the others, Catherine Calderwood was one of those who was in St Andrew's House with me. The number of people in the Scottish Government, however many thousands of people work in the Scottish Government that I hold a mobile phone number for, is extremely limited. It was not my method of communication with Mark Drakeford and Michelle O'Neill. These are discussions with other government leaders that would have been recorded through the normal systems. So I, again, want to be very clear that it was not my practice to not just not take decisions through informal messaging, but have substantial or lengthy or detailed discussions about government decisions through these means. It's not my style, it's not my practice, it's never been my practice, not least because I don't think it is a good or effective or helpful way of reaching decisions, not just taking decisions, but it's not a helpful process in reaching decisions either.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Youssef and Ms Lloyd were produced by you with your second statement. Where did you get them? They
were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
You obviously didn't have those on your own devices because you deleted them, hadn't you?
I didn't retain them in line with the procedure I've already talked about.
Are you creating a distinction between deletion and retaining?
No.
You had deleted them, had you not?
I think deletion, I think, forgive me, I think sounds as if it was a sort of, not bothering to check whether any information was being retained. I was very thorough, and not just in the pandemic, but in all my work in government, to ensure that things were appropriately recorded, but in line with the advice I'd always been given since my first day in government probably was not to retain conversations like that on a phone that could be lost or stolen and therefore not secure.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
And as far as the other messages are concerned that you couldn't produce yourself between you and all these others, you deleted all of those as well? In
the manner that and after the process that I have set out, yes.
You also produced some direct Twitter messages that you've already mentioned with Professor Leach and Professor Sridhar. Professor Sridhar also produced those messages to us, although slightly later than you, at the beginning of December. Did you have any discussions with her about the production of those messages?
I think I let her know that I'd found messages and would be providing them to the inquiry.
So there was contact between you and her related to the messages?
I simply, as a courtesy, to let her know, yes.
This is another exchange. This is not a group that features you, but it's another piece of evidence that we've seen. And I'd be interested in understanding your reflection on some of the content of the exchange. This is in your capacity as the former First Minister and First Minister at the time. This is in a WhatsApp group chat called COVID Outbreak Group. These messages were provided to the inquiry by Dr. Jim McMenamin of Public Health Scotland, who did not delete his messages, and not by the Scottish Government or its officials. In the exchange at 27th of August 2020, you'll recognise, no doubt, the individuals involved. Ken Thompson says, just to remind you seriously, this is discoverable under FOI. Know where the clear chat button is, to which Nicola Sturgeon replies, yes, absolutely. Jason Leach points out DG level input there. Mr. Thompson says, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now clear it again. Jason Leach says, done. Nicola Sturgeon, me too, and someone called Donna Bell and me. Were you aware in your capacity as First Minister that these sort of exchanges took place and that a senior member of the civil service considered plausible deniability to be his middle name?
As you said at the outset of the question, I was not a member of this group until some of these exchanges were explored in evidence sessions last week. I had never seen these messages before. Did I know that there would be WhatsApp groups where officials were exchanging information? I'm not sure I was particularly conscious of it, but I would have, had I been asked to stop and consider that, I would have said, well, I would assume so, given the nature of how people we're working. I would absolutely expect all officials in the Scottish Government to retain, in line with Scottish Government policies, information relevant to our decision making. I look at that exchange and what I don't see is an exchange about the decisions we're taking. I see a light-hearted discussion between officials. Ken Thompson, I know, has been before you and has given his interpretation of that, so he can answer and has answered for himself. I would read that as him reminding people of the need to be professional on WhatsApp, even when discussing light-hearted things. The other thing I would say about all of these individuals on the screen before me is that they are all, in my knowledge and experience, and with some of them, particularly Ken Thompson, this is extensive experience. They are public servants of the utmost integrity. And at this point and throughout the pandemic, they were public servants who were working in a committed and a dedicated fashion in terms of the hours, and they were working the pressure under which they were working above and beyond probably the call of duty. Ken Thompson is somebody I've worked with throughout my time in the Scottish Government, and he is a civil servant, as I say, of the utmost integrity and the utmost professionalism.
This group was called COVID Outbreak Group, obviously connected to the COVID pandemic, yes?
If that is what you're telling me, yes.
One assumes, yes, that is the name of it. One assumes, therefore, it's to do with COVID Outbreak Group, to do with COVID, and therefore relevant to the pandemic. What Mr. Thompson does here is that, despite recognising that material in this chat is discoverable under freedom of information legislation, is to tell other individuals in the group that they should clear it or delete it. Is that not correct?
That is what is in front of me, yes.
Could I just go a little bit further down, please? I'm just tracing the messages down to 1617, so very shortly after the exchange that we've had. At 1617, so this is just a couple of minutes after. Further down, you can see in the background what happens in between. There is something which Jason Leach says at 1617, which is redacted, and then Ken Thompson says the information you requested is not held centrally. Is that a phrase you recognise? Of
course it is, yes. Is
that a phrase which often appears in freedom of information requests when documentation is requested from the Scottish Government?
Yes.
Is it a phrase which indicates, as a result of a request, the Scottish Government is not in a position to be able to provide the information it might otherwise because it doesn't actually hold the information in its central repository?
Yes.
Does it look to you that this is Ken Thompson suggesting that response is an excuse often trotted out by the Scottish Government in response to freedom of information requests?
I absolutely accept that as an interpretation that can be put on it. These are not my words.
Of course.
This is not an exchange I'm involved in, so there is a limit to how far I can go in trying to interpret what he meant by that. In looking at the exchange, my interpretation of it, which may or may not be correct, is that he is reminding the others on the in the chat that the kind of things they are talking about, they probably shouldn't be on a chat like this. You know, somebody says, I was a nippy teenager in 1986, for example. That's the nature of that. Again, all I can repeat about Ken Thompson is that he is a civil servant, in my experience, who took the responsibilities around recording and making sure that the government record was complete extremely seriously. He's one of the civil servants in my experience that was not just most experienced in that, but that was most assiduous in that side of things. So I can't answer for him. I can speak about my experience of him, and I can give an interpretation based on the context of that was meant to be a light-hearted comment, but that is only my interpretation.